As we read too often in the headlines, religious liberty is under attack in this country and around the world. How do we protect our religious freedoms from government overreach? What do we need to know in order to protect our tradition of religious liberty, and why is it important? Joining me now to discuss this and much more is the former Solicitor General of the United States, now author of a new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. Ken Starr joins us. Ken, first of all, thank you for being with us. Before we get to your book, I want to start with the story that's making headlines this week, the verdict in that Derek Chauvin trial. He was, as everyone knows, found guilty on all three charges. Following the verdict, President Joe Biden said this.
It was a murder in the full light of day, and it ripped the blinders off for the whole world to see. The systemic racism is a stain on our nation's soul. The knee on the neck of justice for Black Americans.
Now, even though racism never came up in the trial, Ken, your thoughts on framing this verdict in this way? Is this dangerous?
Of course, it's treacherous. Shame on the President of the United States. It was a time to, in fact, say our system of justice works. Where there's a serious allegation and charge, as there was here, of wrongdoing, of criminal wrongdoing, then that individual defendant has rights. And that includes the right to try his case or to be tried by a jury of his peers. The system worked and the system has spoken. To use this verdict by these jurors as an opportunity, as a platform for criticizing America is exactly the wrong thing in the wrong place. Shame on this president. He's, again, the great unifier. I can work with the other side. This is simply more division, causing rancor at a time when people should be saddened, but nonetheless reassured that the trial, from everything that we've seen, and we saw a lot of it, was in fact full and fair.
Prior to the verdict, Ken, while the jury was still deliberating, President Biden said he was praying the case would go the right way. And then Representative Maxine Waters of California said this in Minnesota.
I hope that we're going to get a verdict that say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
So she said they need to get more confrontational. What impact, Ken, could this have on Chauvin's appeal, both the president's meddling here as well as Representative Maxine Waters?
Well, and the trial judge rightly said there's some concerns here as to what's happening outside. What Congresswoman, Chairwoman Waters was doing was calling for mob rule. This is horrible. Is there no shame, to coin a phrase? So they should all be roundly condemned by thoughtful jurors. They should be condemned, they being President Biden and Maxine Waters, by the American Bar Association. Where's the president of the American Bar, any other bar association? The Minneapolis Bar, for that example, the Minnesota Bar, saying, this is not our system. We believe here in ordered liberty, the rule of law, and you're calling exactly for the opposite. You're just calling for a result that you want. Have you been in the courtroom? Have you listened to all the evidence? No, you haven't. You've been out in the streets screaming. So I think it is utterly irresponsible for Maxine Waters to do what she did. I have doubts whether it will affect the appeal, but then again, let's wait and see what the lawyers do as they carefully assess the entire record.
I want to discuss your very timely book, Ken. You write about the great principles such as autonomy, equality, and accommodation that undergird our system of ordered liberty. How have these principles guided the court and our country when it comes to religious freedom?
The good news is for the last 40 years, even though the culture has radically shifted, to take a position of either, what shall I say, indifference toward religion, not involving oneself in a religious institution, not joining a church or a synagogue and the like. So while the membership lists are falling, the culture has been hardening in a sense of hostility toward religion. And the good news is, and what I want this book to do is for every citizen who cares about these issues to be equipped in the marketplace of ideas to say, you know what you are arguing now is totally inconsistent with what I'm not a lawyer. The Supreme Court has held time and again in terms of freedom of conscience. Institutions cannot be required to perform abortions or to give notice of abortion clinics. That's the law of the land. And not infrequently, Raymond, the very good news is the court has been unanimous in sustaining these great principles of religious liberty.
Hmm.
And these are great principles that every person should know. This is a book for citizens. It's not a book to go on law shelves.
Ken, in the last year during this pandemic, we have seen how religious liberties have been conscripted. You write, many state and local governing authorities significantly limited to outright banned worship services. As a result, church giving declined. In some places, the fall off in giving was so significant that the church staff had to be reduced. Living through the COVID lockdowns, we are vividly aware of the closure of houses of worship while other essential businesses are allowed to remain open. Why did we see so many state governments and lower courts, Ken, target houses of worship in ways that they didn't target businesses?
Yes, insufficient sensitivity to our constitutional order and our constitutional protections. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech. You know, the public officials like that. Governor Newsom likes freedom of speech, right? Governor Cuomo likes freedom of speech. But before you get to freedom of speech in the First Amendment, you get to the free exercise of religion. And at a minimum, that means being able to gather together in community, in a congregation, in a synagogue, and worshiping. And so I think it was a profound miscalculation on the part of governors. I think it's going to be viewed historically by fair-minded persons who are not anti-religion or hostile to religion. It's really a very dark stain on their orders. So how can, and here's an extreme example that made it to the Supreme Court of the United States, Caesar's Palace in Nevada can operate at 50% capacity, but no matter how large the sanctuary, the synagogue, the auditorium is, the fellowship hall, only 50 could gather in Nevada. The Supreme Court has had enough of that. It stepped in around Christmas time and time for Christmas celebrations, Advent celebrations, Hanukkah celebrations, and said enough already. Now, it wasn't unanimous, but still, all we needed five votes, and that's what we had in the church closing cases. The churches are now open.
You write that the sentiment behind the increasingly venomous attack on faith is not hard to discern. We can call it the harm principle, you write. That is, the views of millions of secularist Americans. Religion is now a bad thing. The Biden administration's been pushing this Equality Act, which would not only redefine sex and include sexual orientation and gender identity, but would do away with the Religious Restoration Act of 1993, removing conscience protections from religious persons and institutions. Is this the harm principle in action, Ken?
Yes, the harm principle means simply your exercise of religious liberty, church, individual, group, harms me. How does it harm me? It harms my dignity. Because if you, for example, do not bake a custom cake for my same-sex wedding, if you don't agree to provide music or other kinds of wedding services, you're inflicting harm on me. It's dignitary harm. I'm insulted, I'm hurt, I'm not treated as an equal member of the polity. That's the harm principle. And therefore, we've got to eliminate all these conscientious objections based upon what are being decried as atavistic attitudes and so forth. And yet, of course, as we know, all your viewers know, we're talking about traditions deeply rooted, not in some idiosyncratic faith, but in the faith communities for generations and indeed for millennia. And so in this country, we have historically, Raymond, as you know, protected freedom of conscience. The Equality Act would eradicate freedom of conscience as a reason to say, I can, in fact, perform this particular service, uh,
Mm.
provide. And now we're not talking about, and this is sometimes over argued by our friends on the other side. Oh, you mean you have the right not to serve someone who, on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity? The answer is emphatically not. The poster child cases that of Jack Phillips, the custom masterpiece cake shop cake baker, who said, I serve
Mhm.
everyone. I love everyone. From my faith perspective, I'm called to love everyone. I'm called to love my enemies, or those who would claim to be my enemies, but I can't perform this particular act of artistry. And I hope in a pluralistic society that the majority of Americans will come to their senses, will first of all become informed. That's what's going on. Here is the fundamental point. Equality without exceptions wipes out religious based objections, conscientious objections, which is a radical move
Mhm.
for American law. I happen to think it would be unconstitutional to do so, but let's not have to reach that point. Let's say to the United States Senate, let's say to President Biden, if you care about this country and its traditions, inasmuch as you were an enthusiastic supporter of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, then you
Right.
should say, I cannot sign this in its present form. We've got to protect freedom of conscience.
Well, but just to your point, in January, a judge in North Dakota, Ken, sided with Catholic hospitals in striking down a 2016 Affordable Care Act transgender mandate. This would require doctors and hospitals to perform sex-changing surgeries with no regard for their religious or conscience objections. On Tuesday, the Biden administration appealed the ruling. Why do you think the Biden administration is appealing this, and why compel doctors and hospitals to violate their consciences?
This is the agenda, and the Biden administration is buying into the agenda, which again means freedom of conscience. We're just scuttling that, right? It doesn't count. And that again is a radical departure from our recent traditions. With Roe v.
Mm.
Wade, still the compromise was reached, the Hyde Amendment. All right, the Supreme Court has held by deeply divided vote that there's a constitutional right to a pro choice entirely choice abortion, but we're not going to fund it. Period, full stop. And that was the view of
Mm.
members of Congress in both parties. But the culture has shifted very dramatically. No, we're going to fund abortions. We're going to require pro-life clinics to refer people to abortion clinics and so forth. The Supreme Court thus far has resisted these cultural shifts and has in fact been very strong in favor of freedom of conscience, freedom of association, right? And don't compel people to do that which they just can't in conscience do, absent the
Mm.
most compelling kinds of circumstances. And by the way, quick point, the Supreme Court even held that in the context of a for-profit corporation, Hobby Lobby.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Those owners do not have to provide abortifacients. They had no objection to contraceptives, but there were 4 required methods of contraception plus by
Mm-hmm.
the Obama administration, and the Supreme Court sustained the conscientious objectors of
But Ken, everything now hangs on the Supreme Court. I mean, it seems the ground is increasingly narrowing here for those who want to exercise their religious freedom and their conscience. And the Biden administration recently established a commission to study potential reforms to the Supreme Court, including whether the court should expand beyond 9 justices and whether to retain the lifetime appointment of judges. The idea of taking the number of justices to more than 9 has not been a popular idea among the justices themselves, including liberal icon Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She had this to say about court packing in 2019.
9 seems to be a good number, and it's been that way for a long time. I think that was a bad idea when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to pack the court.
Ken Starr, do you think Congress would approve adding more justices to the Supreme Court? Doesn't this politicize the High Court and tamper with a third branch of government?
Yes, it would terribly politicize it, and Ruth Ginsburg was so right. She put it very simply. It's a bad idea. Or then Senator Biden, boneheaded idea. So this is political entirely because what we do know is that the Supreme Court operates at admirable efficiency. There's no huge backlog. It's not as if, oh, this is terrible, cases aren't getting decided. This is as bad as some, shall I say, third world country with years of backlog. There's no issue. There's no problem whatsoever. Now, there are some issues in the administration of justice, including the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. It's too large. It's been too large for too long, and they keep coming up, including in the church closure areas with boneheaded decisions. But that's the problem, not the Supreme Court. There's no problem. It ain't broke.
Yeah. In the opening chapter of your book, you write, if you know your rights, if you understand the constitutional constraints placed on government when it comes to religious liberty, you'll be ready to fight when the time is right. You'll know how and when to act when the next crisis comes calling. And make no mistake about it, the next crisis is coming. Now, we have seen everything from the Little Sisters of the Poor, seeming unending fight against contraceptive mandates, the houses of worship being closed during the pandemic. What do you see as the next crisis vis-a-vis religious liberty?
Actions of school boards. Be careful. If your children are in the public schools or your grandchildren are in the public schools, be watchful. The State Board of Education, and here's the good news once again, once we equip ourselves and not just have an opinion, we're entitled to that, but let's have principles from which to argue and to be able to say, I never went to law school, but I happen to know that there's a case that said, if you vote in favor of that, let's say excluding a Bible study club from campus, which is a recurring issue. I'm not a lawyer. I understand you're going to be subjected to the possibility of punitive damages, and you can't look to the school board for indemnification. It's actually true. Be careful what it is, school board members and school education board members. I use that just as an example. It may be the city council, as with Philadelphia, yanking the license of Catholic social services in Philadelphia to provide these precious children in the city of brotherly love with foster placement services. And why was the yank after over a century of providing these services faithfully and well? Because Catholic social services placement policies are consistent with Catholic social teaching, and no child would be placed in a non-traditional home. That was too much for the Philadelphia Inquirer and for the city authorities. Those city authorities, shame on them, because I'm very disappointed, frankly, that inner city Black pastors, and I'm just going to say it, African American pastors, didn't organize and march on City Hall to say shame on you. But I'll tell you this, courage is needed right now. We need the courage of our convictions so that that grandparent who reads the book can say, you know, I'm going to call up my school board member and I'm going to have a preemptive cup of coffee with that person. And in a winsome way, say, by the way, I want you to know you may be under some pressure to adopt a policy or whatever, but here's the problem. It's called freedom of conscience, or one of the other great principles that I describe in the book, in a way by telling stories that everybody, including high school students, can find accessible and usable.
Ken Starr, thank you for being here. Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty by Ken Starr is available in bookstores everywhere and online. Ken, thanks again.
Thank you, Raymond.